So I was really interested in what you were saying about public memory and the gossips from mothers. And I was just really curious about how do you connect those pieces of memories into a fictional story? Like how do you translate those pieces of impressions? Like you were saying, maybe it's just like a projection of emotion. And what is the specific form of memory that you choose to make into the new story?
Thanks for the question. I think for me, because those memories of hearing the women in my family would share things, there was a certain excitement of, as a child, the memory that I had was my mom would say, did you know about this? This is, whether you see it as gossip, but there's still a beginning, middle, and end. So for me, that's a form of storytelling and a form of memory. And I take it with me where I remember when I was in primary school, there were storytelling competition. It discusses how you engage the audience. It's a way of dictating, or it's also language. I remember participating in it and understanding as a child that was a lot about delivery, how you engage someone. So those memory, I think, presents itself as I get older, and I think that I have to kind of, okay, I think this is actually quite cinematic. Let's put that into the scene. But then in my mind, it obviously goes into like, this is the source came from this certain memory that I've had as a child or somewhere in my life, but I'm trying to translate it onto film, and then it's putting it on script and then constructing it in a way where I also now have the liberty to change certain things because I can. So then instead of creating these memories, just creating some sort of space that is the source material comes from something that I've had in my head or a moment that I've had. Like talk about projecting my memory also. I think it's all of that is putting it onto something that's tactile and then filming it and then create. So it is so much of that process of construction. I feel like that's my way of storytelling, which is the same as, but in a different way, how my mom would tell me, for example, about something that happened to someone that in a neighborhood. But because she's using words to create that image in your head, I am using that image to kind of creating it, but using other forms, props, actors, clothes, trying to create the sense of constructing this image that I've had. Similarly, I think in a way of like, if there is a certain memory that I want to remember, but there's only one thing in that memory that I remember, I try to put that into the scene or into the image I'm trying to construct. So I guess in that way, I'm also just creating a memoryscape for myself, but in a much more expensive way. Just because, you are working with other people to create that space, but also in the narrative form, it still needs to make sense. It's not just a memoryscape, but you're still telling a story. There's still a beginning, there's still a middle, and there's an end.
Okay, another question from Mona. Can you talk more about the Chinese language anxiety in Singaporean films? For example, in few Chinese films like I Not Stillville, Anthony Chan's West Season, we can see that all these directors, they're unconsciously trying to pay attention to the significance of position of Chinese education, the Chinese language in a multilingual society of Singapore. Have you ever considered in your process of filmmaking this kind of language anxiety?
I've thought about it, not on my film, but for like what was mentioned in Anthony's and Jack Neo's two films, 小孩不笨 and 热带雨. I think for me, maybe subconsciously I have, because that's a reality we live in. So in Singapore, I wanted the actors to speak in multiple dialects and able to sort of switch from local Singaporean Chinese to a dialect just like that, and then all English. Then I found out that the censorship board in Singapore sets a quota, and I don't know how to do this, of how much dialect can be used. It was part of a Speak Mandarin campaign that we've had. So it's just to kind of eradicate the use of dialects in media. And so it was a very conscious effort to make people speak good Chinese and good Mandarin.
Yeah.
And I think it's almost linked to the question of the language anxiety that is in the film. And I think it's subconscious. I don't feel like it's very conscious on their part to want to address that. Sometimes it happens and it's almost kind of like becomes a joke. The inadequacy of the language become part of the joke. I didn't think I wanted to be very conscious of that, but it's definitely a hindrance in films where, because that's the reality of Singaporeans, is that yes, we speak multiple languages, but then we're not really good at
any of them.
And there's so much complexity and layers to a language that we have to find our own. So I remember on Ajuma, it's almost kind of like with my actors, it is even a simple nuance of how you say certain things, what it really means to her, and the silence of those in-between spaces that you're trying to say something. So it's not so much of like the language anxiety, but it's also like, yeah, we know we have the inadequacy of the language, but we've also created our own language in that sense. For example, just saying, not Mandarin, but saying thank you. It represents a certain class or a certain background of a Singaporean Tama who says thank you in this thank you. I don't know how to explain it. I remember she would say it in different ways, and then she said it like that. And I said, remember to just, when you say thank you, it's always this way. Thank you. Thank you. It almost sounds very comical. It became very natural for her to say that. And I noticed one thing about when I was sitting in the audience to watch the film, only in Singapore, when she says that, the audience would react and laugh and go like, oh my God.
Okay.
But nowhere else in the world, like when I was sitting and screening in the US or wherever, no one really laughs at that. Only in Singapore, people will laugh. And then one time I was in Sydney, I heard laughter and I realized only Singaporeans were laughing at that. I remember talking about it, and then someone wrote an op-ed about the film and titled it Thank You. And she said, this auntie, just say this one word. Even though it's a Singaporean Korean film, the one word solidified this moment where you realize this is a very Singaporean film, because if you've been in this part of the world, you realize you've heard the way that is being spoken. It becomes a memory. I got a foreign friend who watched the film, but he lives here. So when he heard that, he was like, oh my God, the coffee shop auntie that I know speaks like that. So it becomes this thing where it's like, it's an insight thing. So I'm also then introducing you to a world that is completely Singaporean, but in a landscape that is very Korean, that exists if you watch Korean drama. So it's interesting that I have an audience in Saudi Arabia who came up to me after the screening and said, this is my first Singaporean film. I love Korean drama, which is why I came to watch this film, because I thought it was about Korean, this sounds interesting. I've never seen a Singaporean film, and this is my first. And I realized I've never seen Singapore. I don't know what it is, but now I kind of like understand a little bit of that world. So it's almost creating this memory-scape for her, where she's never been there, but she also kind of through the film seen or feel this idea of what Singapore is. But I'm sorry, I'm digressing with the question about the Chinese language anxiety. If anything, it's more a personal handicap for me that I have the anxiety of language. I'm trying to get better at it. Like I can speak Mandarin, I can converse in Mandarin, but obviously my mind is going both ways, right? Where I feel more confident in one than the other. So I think that's one of the anxiety that we talked about. But I think it's just trying to reflect it on film is a bit different. But recently I had to judge for high school students a Chinese short film competition, which I didn't even know existed before this.
Oh, I saw that post, yeah.
And I watched these films that the students make. And it's never about the language anxiety, but it's about grasping the language at hand and making a film that's purely in Mandarin. And just using the language as a way to tell a story. It's not about promoting the language or anything, but it is making sure that this is the theme of what you're supposed to make and then come up with something. It was also interesting to see this very young generation of filmmakers tell stories that I think would be a bit different 10, 20 years ago. And they have very different perspective of the world now. So I have hopes for the future of Singapore cinema. And I know I'm one of them. I'm not that old, so I do think Singapore cinema in the placement of the world is still a very young territory and more access to filmmaking available now. So it will be interesting to see the very different voices that's going to come out from Singapore. There is a good film that I want to share with the audience that if you're curious to watch and understand actually the complexity of language, especially Chinese language, there's a very good documentary by the Singaporean filmmaker Eva Tang, 我们唱过的歌.
That one, The Songs We Sang, yeah.
That is a very good example of the language anxiety, especially China. The history is actually very complex.
Yeah, it was really well made. Part of it was shot in NTU.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's about Singaporean Chinese folk music, but it comes to a time where there is that tension of being Chinese educated and then English became this language. So if you have a chance to watch it, I think it gives a lot of answer to the anxiety that
exactly.
Like even with my actress Hong Hui Fang, so she was telling me that she came at a time as a student where everything was taught in Mandarin. So she was 15 where the government policy changed overnight, where everything has been taught in English. So she struggled. She didn't graduate from high school because to go from like having learned everything in Chinese and to go with like everything's in English now, she couldn't pass the entrance exam, and so she can read English and speak English. But she's always had this handicap of like, when we were in Sydney, she was like, yeah, my English is not that good. But I struggled because she realized it's because of these policy changes that came overnight, that part of this tension that we have as Singaporean Chinese, English educated and Chinese educated Singaporean Chinese.
Even today, you can still see that linguistic boundary in today's Singapore, between different language groups and different generations, especially. I think that's also very interesting is that Singapore, for a lot of our audience, for our, Chinese audience or Chinese American audience, I think is a very unique, it has a really unique position, right? A lot of people would assume it as sort of a culture or language enclave of China. But on the other hand, it's way more diversity and way more complexity to its own history and culture in there. When we see, as Chinese speaker, we see Singapore as something that is simultaneously distant but also familiar. That's just a very interesting tension there. So I think maybe in the future you can share in more films made in China or made for Chinese audiences. That'll be a very interesting experiment.
It's interesting now that there are certain successful Chinese language drama made in Singapore. For example, there's 雾锁南洋, which is about Chinese immigrants who, this is made in the 80s, I think. So China has now remade that drama series. I think it's iQIYI who has remade this, which is really interesting to watch that version of it. It was about the struggles of early Chinese immigrants in Singapore. So Little Nyonya, Xiao Niang, which is
Little Nyonya,
was very popular when it came out.
Very popular in China.
So now China also remade their version, but they all use some of the actors are the same. So like Singaporean actors would reprise their roles. So I'm always sort of like, wow, that's really interesting to see their version and understanding like what has changed, what is different. I know even when Xiao Niang came out in Singapore, there were criticism of like, actually Peranakan, a lot of times they don't speak Mandarin. They speak Malay or they speak dialect, or sometimes they speak English. I have Chinese friends who are Peranakan who don't speak Mandarin. So there were criticism when Xiao Niang came out. It's like, this is wrong. They can't speak Mandarin. They grew up in a culture where they have to speak Malay, But it was a very popular series. So things can change, I think. Like for entertainment, sometimes things change. But it's interesting to see the remix of Singaporean dramas. Anyway,
It also came as a surprise for a lot of my Chinese friends or even Chinese American friends. When they visit Singapore, they have the assumption that, everybody will speak Chinese. And when they came to Singapore, everything was written in English and everyone just speaking English. That was a kind of a culture shock or a counter-culture shock for a lot of people. So I think that's something to take notice of when you see Singaporean art and films.
Yes.